Aha. Welcome. 10% walks in. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Lynda Fairbairn to come and speak here. Lynda's already kind of taught here in the History and Theory program. Once I think even took students on a trip to Mantua. And she's going to speak this evening on Giovanni Battista Montano, related as it is to her catalogue. She has catalogued the kind of Renaissance drawings from the collection of Sir John Soane, held in the John Soane Museum, and her previous research as an architectural historian has involved research on Giulio Romano and research in the RIBA collection of drawings on Palladio towards the big Palladio exhibition that was held at the Hayward Gallery in London. So, if everyone's comfortably seated, it's a very great pleasure to welcome Lynda.
Thank you. The striking feature of Sir John Soane's collection is that the collection is made up entirely of Renaissance sketchbooks and albums, so that often whole collections of material are dedicated to one artist, and that is the case of the artist that I want to talk to you about tonight, who is Giovanni Battista Montano. So, who was Montano? Sir John Soane wrote this question on the sheet of paper which he filed in one of 3 volumes of over 350 drawings by him, which he had bought at the Robert Adams sale at Christie's in 1818. He must have recognized a kindred spirit, at least in the way that Montano imagined the ruins of Rome revived. And I should like to answer Soane's question this evening more fully than he was able to. And I show on the left-hand side the view of, by Gandhi, of Soane's sepulchral chapel at Tyringham, which shows the hanging dome on pointed pendentives, rather similar to the tomb on the right-hand side by Montano of one of the tombs on the Via Appia. Similar in the sense of the proportions of the walls to the huge dome. Giovanni Battista Montano was a woodcarver, a model maker, a draftsman, an architect, and a lecturer on architecture, whose large corpus of curious and intriguing designs after Roman antiquities entered the curriculum of the Accademia and became famous, although he was not. He was born in Milan in circa 1540, and according to Baglione, who described his facility as a woodcarver, like one who models in wax, he came to Rome during the papacy of Gregory XIII, that is between 1572 and 1585. His study of antiquity was probably well established by 1579, when he is recorded as a member of the Virtuosi al Pantheon, a group of architects and artists who from the 1550s met to examine drawings and discuss ancient architecture. As one of the founder members of the Accademia di San Luca, the Painters' Academy in Rome, he delivered his first lecture on architecture to the Accademia on the 8th of May of 1594. After Montano's death in 1621, the architect Giovanni Battista Soria published a selection from Montano's drawings of the orders in a volume of engravings entitled Architettura, and a selection from his hypothetical reconstructions of Roman brick tombs in the Roman countryside in a second volume entitled Scelta or Selection, in 1625. The collections of engravings, which were reprinted several times, transmitted Montano's influence to the great architects of the Baroque and beyond to the architects of the Enlightenment, to Robert Adam and to Soane. So even though Soane didn't know who he was from his drawings, he certainly knew the engravings well before he had actually acquired the drawings by Montano. So on the right-hand side, we have an engraving by Montano, which had a certain influence with the Baroque. It influenced the design of Borromini's perspectival gallery at Palazzo Spada, and probably was the source for Bernini's Scala Regia. The curious feature, though, of the perspective of Montano's design is that it's rather like looking down a telescope the wrong way. You see the perspective works in the opposite direction to the way that you would expect it to. There's a portrait of Montano up on the left, which shows Montano drawn by the great engraver Francesco Villamena. Since 4 of Montano's designs for frontispieces exist, it has been assumed that he intended to publish the designs. However, several independent sets of drawings and multiple copies of single drawings have survived, a fact which suggests that the drawings were originally available for sale as sets of drawings with frontispieces or as single sheets. Over 1,000 drawings have survived by Montano, although with only 350 survive in the Soane. But the Soane set is the most complete set of the designs which relate to the publication. It is clear from the surviving drawings that they form part of a larger corpus of antique art and exemplary buildings for the use of architects, artisans and dilettanti as a stock of images than any other by a single architect available on the market in Rome at the end of the 16th century. Montano was active during one of the most conservative and dull periods of Roman architecture. He's been judged harshly by modern architectural historians who view his drawings as childish. I show on the right a drawing of a tomb made from 2 inverted triangles in the geometric basis of the plan, with a sort of ice cream cone tower on the top to illustrate the childish nature of his reconstructions. All of them acknowledge the power of his images over Baroque architects, but his way of representing ancient architecture arouses their scorn because of his apparent lack of scientific method. He's defined routinely, and I quote, as the classic example of an anti-archaeological current in the reforming climate of the second half of the 16th century. Possibly because of the puzzled expression on his face, which seems far from erudite, his culture is described as modest, and he is defined as illiterate. Yet he was a respected source for architects and for antiquarians like Cassiano del Pozzo, who acknowledged him as an authority on aspects of antiquity. And Montano's sources and aims have never been evaluated sympathetically to assess the grounds for their respect. The study of the 5 orders of architecture, entitled, like Vignola's treatise, Regola degli Cinque Ordini, is treated entirely visually. It provides simple methods for the design and proportion of the orders of columns or pilasters, with or without capital, with or without pedestals, in arcades or colonnades. He did not seek exemplary forms for the various parts of the orders like other authorities. So he just shows there, in the case of the composite order, that it's made up of 10 modules, that the whole order is divided into 5. One part is given to the entablature and the others are given to the column. For architects like Giuvara, Montano's authority on the ordered resided in the variety of the capitals and bases, he recorded from the vast range of authentic Roman figural capitals which still survived in the ruins of Rome, and he freely invented his own types from them, which he described in annotations on the drawings with the term capriccio, in the sense of poetic invention. This is quite an early use of the term used in that sense. Vasari used it a little earlier to mean something which is not classical. He offered the widest range of Doric capitals which were available right the way through to the 18th century, and he cited Baldassare Peruzzi, who preferred Doric capitals with a more compressed ovolo, as the source of his image of the antique Doric capital. And there is the engraved image of the antique capital, and on the right, Montano's collection, or one of the collections of composite capitals. Originally, the drawings of the ancient buildings in the corpus must have offered a fairly comprehensive coverage of Roman buildings still standing in Rome, which were illustrated by both Palladio and Serlio, the two main engraved collection of buildings available at the time, as well as the monuments, by which I mean the arches, the temples and fora in the city. He recorded the Roman tombs, which were called in the 17th century tempieti, in the Roman Campagna, and which are largely unrecorded by other architects. And here I show a tomb which was also illustrated at basement level by Serlio in Book 5, not as an antique building, but as a church plan. Montano shows it as a tomb. It seems that the building did indeed exist. Other drawings of it survive, and it's described as being at Palestrina. And he shows the upper level of the tomb, and another drawing also shows the basement level by Montano. So a few of the tombs recorded by Montano are also published by Serlio in Book 3, and others were published by Serlio as church plans in Book 5, as the case here on the left. But the majority of the plans derive from Montano's research into Renaissance architectural sketchbooks, which also recorded buildings like this one, which have long since ceased to exist. He completed the collection of drawings of the orders of antique buildings and tombs with the drawings of funeral monuments, sarcophagi, cinerary urns and vases, many of which can be traced to famous Renaissance collections in Rome. Here is an example of urns, in this case from a collection which is otherwise unknown, which was in the vineyard of Antonio Toscanella, which contained, on the bottom right, the urn of Tiberius Claudius Phoebus, which is now in the Vatican, and which was not recorded by any other 16th century draftsman. He transcribes their Latin lapidary inscriptions competently. This was not a simple feat, because letters were often very worn. A P, for example, could be mistaken for an R, and so on. And it requires a thorough knowledge of Latin to transcribe them correctly and to decipher the abbreviations. So you can see that certainly the description of illiterate certainly doesn't match Montano. So it seems when he was making his collection of material, he was making a very complete collection, which would range from architecture to sculpture to epigraphy. All of the drawings, none of the drawings, except the drawings which have inscriptions, Roman inscriptions, were accompanied by any captions of any sort. The engraved images all have captions which were added by the editor and often invented, which is another reason why Montano's images were treated with so much impatience by historians. Montano's apprenticeship in Lombardy, where the schools trained sculptors and architects particularly well to achieve high standards of craftsmanship for wood and stone carving, was fundamental both to his contacts in Rome as well as to the development of his taste. The domination of the Italian market by Lombard sculptors and artisans is described by Bertolotti, who characterized the Della Porta workshop as constituting almost the whole history of Renaissance sculpture in Rome. Montano maintained close links with the Della Porta, who all had powerful connections in the city. Guglielmo della Porta, the sculptor, who also restored antiques and architect, was one of the most important architects of his day. He was awarded a large honorary salary as Keeper of the Papal Seal by Paul III in 1546, which endured until his death in 1577. This was the same position that Sebastiano del Piombo had held, which is why he's called Del Piombo, means of the lead, which means that he held the lead seal of the Pope. And his son, Teodoro della Porta, were both close friends of Montano's. And Montano worked as an architectural joiner and model maker for Giacomo della Porta, who was not a brother. It's actually not clear what his relationship was to Guglielmo, but anyway, he was the architect of St. Peter's. So Montano's social connections, which he'd made initially in Lombardy, placed him at the heart of architectural patronage and artistic life in Rome. He was the leading architectural woodcarver in Rome, and he carved the organs at San Giovanni in Laterano and at the Madonna of Loreto. And he lived near to Guglielmo della Porta, who had 3 large properties on Via Giulia near to Palazzo Farnese. So this is Montano's ornamental taste was developed by a tradition in Lombardy of using rich figural decoration based on antique ornamental prototypes. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide of the highly ornamental columns from antiquity that Montano designed, but I show the Colleone Chapel in Bergamo by Amadeo, just to give a feeling for the kind of highly decorated architecture that was built in Milan from the 15th century, with encrusted really with ornament and decoration. Many of the plans celebrated in his drawing, which are based on antique plans, are familiar from Lombard architecture. On left and right, I show 2 buildings which I think are related in their planning. The complex geometric planning of the grand 4th century churches built in Milan when it was an imperial city was still standing in Montano's lifetime. They were only demolished during the 16th and 17th centuries, but their complex planning was still visible, can still be admired in the plan of San Lorenzo on the left. And I think the plan on the right by Montano slightly recalls the plan of San Lorenzo, although not entirely. At the end of the 15th century, it should be remembered, Milan was one of the most important centres of architectural patronage. Leonardo was the court architect and Bramante was resident in the city. At a time when an outstanding group of architectural projects with complex plans was produced there. And I show a drawing by Francesco Di Giorgio on the left, who came to the city as a consultant for the constructions of the cathedrals of Milan and Pavia, which you can see on the left-hand side, which are complex in their planning with their very wide crossing and with the satellites and the transepts radiating from them, which is a feature of repeated frequently in Montano's architecture. And the none of Montano's studies for the reconstructions of ancient monuments has survived. In the annotations on the finished drawings, he mentions only 2 architects. In one, he refers to Baldassare Peruzzi, and in another, he mentions Antonio da San Gallo, in a reference to a scale. From the study of these drawings, 2 precise sources emerge. a small group of drawings are copied from Francesco di Giorgio, and here I show a drawing from the Codex Ashburnham, which contains drawings which were copied from Francesco di Giorgio, and on the right-hand side, Montano's version of the same plan. There are several others which are copied from the same source. Francesco di Giorgio was, of course, probably Peruzzi's master. They certainly knew each other. They were both Sienese. The largest group of the Tempietti derived from or were inspired by drawings of the Roman tombs by Baldassare Peruzzi and his son Salustio. Many of Montano's geometrical plans, based on pentagons, hexagons, and triangles, on the left the pentagonal plan, and on the right the hexagonal plan, which is based on two intersecting triangles, are also found in Peruzzi's drawings. Let me see, that's a drawing sketched by Peruzzi for the same tomb, Peruzzi's drawings after the antique. Other drawings derived from a sketchbook by Baldassare Peruzzi entitled The Taccuino di Fabbriche Moderne, which is in the Uffizi. Several motifs in the Taccuino, which are sources for key ideas which were taken up by Baroque architects, like on the left-hand side, the setting of a cylindrical building within concave enclosures, central plans with radiating satellites, all of these were developed by Peruzzi in the Taccuino. The drawing on the left is a drawing from the Taccuino by Baldassare Peruzzi, and the radiating satellite drawing on the right is an engraving after one of Montano's drawings. The extraordinary plan of a tomb which was published without acknowledgement by Serlio and described by him as outside Rome in ruins is drawn completely in a plan in the Taccuino by Baldassare and Salustio Peruzzi. It doesn't look as though it's drawn completely by them. What's happened is Baldassare took the sketchbook and underdrew incised with a stylus exactly the plan that you see on the right-hand side, and then Salustio later on filled in the plan but slightly differently. This hasn't actually been noticed before, but it really has happened. I'm sorry that it's not visible on the slide. The plan with strong diagonal axes was important to later architects, especially Pietro da Cortona. It was the source for his design for San Luca Martina in Rome, the church of the Artists' Academy of San Luca. It is almost certain that Montano knew Peruzzi's composition, the Allegory of Mercury, which is on the left and right with a detail on the right. In the centre of the composition on the right, the restored section and elevation of a theatre is represented in perspective above a perspective of a quarter plan of the theatre. It is set in a cityscape composed of complete buildings with arches, temples, porticos and towers, with the towers with superimposed, changing geometrical plans, all designed in a revived classical language. And the buildings in the allegory supply the prototypes for the two different ways Montano reconstructed Roman buildings. On the left, on the one hand, the Roman theatre is reconstructed archaeologically. By that I mean that its elevation is shown in perspective below a perspectival depiction of a plan, just as in the same way that the engraving of that tomb in Palestrina is shown at the basement level on the plan itself is shown in perspective above it. And the typical, the telescopic elevations of towers in Peruzzi's drawings are the source for Montano's fanciful elevations for tumulus tombs, which are drawn as complete modern buildings, decorated with sculpture, also in a revived classical idiom. Remember that nobody actually knew what elevations of the tumulus tombs actually looked like. So they were open completely to any kind of reconstruction. Montano always shows buildings as though they're complete. He never shows ruins. Often no scale is indicated, and where a scale is shown, several units of measurement of canne, of palmi and piedi are used. The buildings are always reduced to a small size, and the reduction in scale was probably designed to achieve uniformity and to eliminate distinction between the buildings on the grounds of size. A process which makes the tombs, which are usually the real tombs, which are usually very small, more accessible as exemplary types for other kinds of buildings. The idea of uniformity of scale belongs to a letter from Guglielmo della Porta to Bartolomeo Amanati, where he refers to a set of drawings he owned and used for comparative study. He wrote, "I have drawings of 5 projects for the dome of St. Peter's. After Bramante, Antonio Sangallo, Raphael, Peruzzi, and the project in construction, all drawn to one scale so that one is not favoured above another." The buildings are represented following several drawings conventions, which show different ways of using perspective, and Montano's sources give a unique view which can help to clarify the development of applications of perspective to architectural drawings, an important subject which was addressed by Wolfgang Lotz in the 60s in connection with images of the interior, but it has still not been fully confronted. In some drawings, as the case on the right-hand side, the building is drawn in section by crumbling away the facade simply. This is an instantly recognizable convention. It gives prominence to vaults, and it both restores the building while it acknowledges that the building is in reality a ruin. And the convention was used by Giuliano Sangallo and many artists after him. Actually, Giuliano Sangallo always shows that the buildings are ruined, but actually that particular convention of crumbling away a facade in order to show a section he only uses on one sheet of drawings. Another convention, which you can see on the left, is a reflection of a method which was recommended by Raphael for the projected survey of ancient Rome, which he outlined in a letter, which he described in a letter to Leo X, in which buildings were to be restored to their original form and represented in plan, which was called ichnographia, 2 sections, orthographia, and a third kind of drawing as a perspectival view, which was called scenographia. Montano often gives an orthogonal half elevation juxtaposed with a perspectival half section. In fact, in this case, you've got that both section and elevation are orthogonal. But there on the left-hand side, he shows it above the plan of a building. The buildings which he records in this way are usually those which had survived almost intact, though often half full of earth, in the Roman countryside. To the Renaissance, they were full of lizards and of snakes, and often the draftsmen were quite afraid to go there. And the drawing on the left is one of the tombs which survived on Via Latina until some catastrophe occurred in the late 18th century when it was destroyed. We don't know why. We know that simply that it did survive until that date. His small-scale drawings are elegant, detailed, lucid views of the reconstructed tombs, which do not deviate from other Renaissance drawings by more respected draftsmen of the same monuments. And on the left now we have the tomb of the Calventi, which still exists, and it was also drawn by Baldassare Peruzzi in the same kind of small-scale elevation and section, which also shows the building restored. I'm sorry I don't have a slide of that. In another type of I'm not sure where oh, sorry, yes, I'll just go back. Oh, sorry. Yes, in another kind of representation, which you can see here, Montano also gives perspectival renderings of the interior above perspectives of half or quarter plans. The same perspectival method for rendering both plan and elevation was recommended by Ignazio Dante, who added an engraving of the Temple of Portumnus at Porto as an illustration of it, which you can see on the left-hand side. He added it as an illustration to an annotation at the end of one of Vignola's rules in Perspectiva Pratica, and he attributed the design of the engraving to Vignola in the annotation. In the annotation, Dante acknowledged that Vignola was prevented by death from leaving a commentary on the plate, and he attributed the omission of the plan of the chamber of the temple to the engraver. The plan is given on the, in perspective, but of the basement. Montano's reconstruction on the right-hand side of the section, which also shows the recessed oval panels in the dome, the deep ribs and the cornices projecting over the marble columns, as well as the stair leading to the basement, is certainly based on the engraving of the elevation. Peruzzi drew the plan of the temple on Uffizi 539A recto as part of his famous survey of Trajan's port at Ostia, which was later published by both Serlio and Labaco. He reconstructed the plan correctly, while Montano altered the sequences of niches, probably because he prefers to enter buildings through an internal semicircular niche, which is incidentally a preference inherited from Peruzzi's projects for buildings, for contemporary buildings. In Peruzzi's drawing, the plan of the temple is given at basement level. That's the plan of the temple up there at basement level. Where he shows an ambulatory around the chamber. There's the ambulatory around the chamber. Within a circular outer wall, which is also shown on the engraving, and is the source for Montano's reconstruction. The Montano also shows the step down to the ambulatory, and that's the basement under the chamber. In the view published by Dante, the description of the masonry construction of the voussoirs of the arches, the way that the profiles of the arches are drawn, and the rectangular windows piercing the wall of the niche are close to drawings by Peruzzi. And here on the right-hand side, I show the drawing of the Roman theatre at Ferento, where he shows many construction details, these construction details are not frequently recorded by Renaissance architects, and Peruzzi is one of the few who describes them. Peruzzi also used perspective as a convention in architectural drawings, both in his studies of ancient monuments, in the sketch of the baths at the baths of Diocletian, as well as in presentation drawings, and the method of drawing the section in perspective with a perspectively foreshortened plan he used spectacularly in the analytic study of Bramante's project for St. Peter's. This type of aerial view is usually associated with the kind of drawings which were made in the workshop of St. Peter's during Bramante's term as architect, which was during Peruzzi's early years in Rome. In fact, Peruzzi may have been in the workshop of St. Peter's right from the beginning, but it isn't actually clear. He was employed by Raphael and Stanze in 1503. So I show on the left-hand side a view from Codex Conaire, which some historians say was made in the workshop of St. Peter's from the circle of Bramante and San Gallo, but it's not by any means clear, and it's a highly contrived view of the Pantheon, which is drawn as though the draftsman is sitting on top of the entablature of the second order. Peruzzi developed if the two drawings have any connection to each other, and I'm certainly not completely convinced. Peruzzi developed the convention to a much greater naturalism. In the image of the Temple of Portumnus, the Dante image, he represents the section of the structure of the wall in the engraving in perspective, which is an unusual feature, which is also found in Antonio Labaco's Libro Appartenente all'Architettura, which was first published in 1552. In the engraving of the Doric temple at Santa Maria in Carcere at the theatre of Marcellus. And it is indeed images of this type in Labaco's engraving, which are clearly the model for the design of the engraving itself, as well as for designs by Montano. And I would suggest that it was probably Labaco, and not who was a collaborator with Peruzzi. He collaborated with him in drawing Roman buildings, and he worked as an expert surveyor on Raphael's historical topographical survey of ancient Rome before Raphael died on the 6th of April in 1520. And I would suggest that Labaco is the artist who made the drawing of the engraving. Labaco and Vignola had both worked with Peruzzi, and Christoph Turnus's suggestion that they collaborated as theorists and editors could explain Dante's confusion over the attribution of the engraving. Montano certainly had the work of both authors in mind. He borrowed the title of Vignola's treatise, Regola degli Cinque Ordini, for 3 of the drawn frontispieces of his own book, and a drawing in the Ashmolean in Oxford is entitled Libro di Giovanni Battista Montani appartenente all'architettura, after Labaco's book. Piero Ligorio, the archaeologist and architect of St. Peter's, also used three-dimensional representation to depict ancient monuments in their hypothetically restored form in his Encyclopedia of Antiquity. But he did not use Renaissance linear perspective, and he has been credited with the rediscovery from Roman reliefs of a Roman convention for representing buildings, in which the facade of a building and its flank are depicted as though they're on the same plane. Here we're seeing a brick tomb on the Via Latina, where you could see that it's not Renaissance pictorial perspective. The parts of the buildings are not interrelated. Each is viewed and drawn separately. when Montano reconstructed the tomb at Porta Capena, he used a perspectival variant of this convention. Using oblique perspective, he achieved simultaneous views of both long and cross sections of the building, as well as the facade. This is a convention which continued to be successful and had a long history well into the 18th century. But it results in slightly ugly roofline in particular, which I shall return to. The simultaneous viewing of the flank and facade is organized perspectively in Montano's drawing of the tomb of Anna Regilla, also on the Via Appia, which still survives there, where the flank is drawn more or less orthogonally and combined with an oblique perspective of the reconstructed temple front. The convention with the oblique perspective on the right has a precise prototype in a view in Codex Détaillé B in the Hermitage, which is another drawing which came from the circle of Peruzzi. And it's that drawing on the left. The representation of the tomb of the relief from the tomb of Hatteri, where only partial perspective is employed, provides the antique precedent for these kinds of views. The tomb is drawn in front view and the side proceeds from it with slightly receding lines. The representational method in both cases is analogous to the display of a building described by Vitruvius as scenografia, the third type of drawing Raphael intended to use in the survey, which has not so far been isolated in concrete examples. To find examples of an interest of antique perspective in drawings from Peruzzi's circle is not surprising, because in the first instance he was closely connected with Raphael, but his own deep theoretical interest in perspective and scenography would have guaranteed it, and this interest certainly derives from his great Sienese predecessor and master, Francesco di Giorgio. Peruzzi designed one of the earliest Vitruvian stage sets for the performance of La Calandra, which is now lost, and his interest in perspective is obvious from his paintings in the Sala delle Prospettive in the Farnesina in Rome, and it culminated in the scenographic setting for the Allegory of Mercury, which we have seen. One should also remember that an interest in the drawings of this kind may not have been purely antiquarian. The antique convention is of great interest in itself because of the ease with which such drawings could be reproduced with only a pen and a ruler. It's important because when they were doing the research on these kind of drawings in the workshop of St. Peter's, they weren't just doing it for academic interest. They were actually trying to find conventions through which they could produce drawings quickly, which could be circulated through to the vast workshop. So the conventional linear perspective as used by painters was not actually very useful for architecture that had to be copied in multiple copies. The perspectival depiction of the tomb at Porta Capena, just to refresh your memory. The perspectival depiction of the tomb at Porta Capena resulted in a distortion in the section of the vault and roof, which may have stimulated two other perspectivally organized plans. In Volume 2, Folds 62 and 83, which are interesting both for the use of perspective as the subject of the design, as well as for the way that they illustrate one of the structural complexities of central planned Roman buildings like, for example, Santa Costanza. The fan-shaped building on the left is based on a segment of the drawing known as the Tempio Inconsiderato of Domenico da Varignano, which was probably developed from studies for St. Peter's, and which was a plan that was certainly still being studied by the academic architects at the Accademia di San Luca in the 18th century. It occurs over and over again in the architecture, particularly of Robert Adam. Of course, Adam may have been thinking of Montano's drawing. So, the fan-shaped building is based, it's simply a section of the Tempio Inconsiderato. It's organized, the plan is organized perspectively with the diameters of the columns reducing towards the center. The section of both of Montano's drawings illustrate the way to reconcile the different radii of the arches in the narrow bays in the center of the building with the wider bays on the perimeter, which is the structural problem that occurs in central buildings like Santa Costanza. The problem of increasing the arches in the perspectively organized arcade is resolved in a way that Peruzzi shows in a diagram on a drawing of a spiral stair. You see the diagram right up at the top. It's actually, I've reversed the drawing so that you can see it a bit more clearly, where he shows that if you insert a fraction of the radius to increase the height of the arch. In the triangular plan on Vol 124, Vol 83, the arch of the vault of the narrow bays rises progressively to an enormous arch at the back of the building, resulting in an exaggerated, heavy roof line. In the second, on Vol 62, the ugly roof line is avoided by using an aggregate plan, one of Montano's solutions to these structural problems. So I would suggest that these strangely distorted projects are actually little puzzles which the students of the Accademia could dwell on. There's obviously much more to it than that, but I would be interested in your suggestions. Montano often supplied more than one reconstruction for buildings. He made a conventional reconstruction of a Roman tomb which no longer survives on the Via Appia, using the archaeological researches of other draftsmen. You can see it on the right-hand side. It's a very beautiful tomb with a gallery running around the sides. It's two-story, with the galleries above the aisles. It was recorded in the Detailler album. And on the right-hand side, he made a second plan using perspective in which the building is barely recognizable. He maintained the three-aisle plan, which rises at one end to a second story, and he maintained the rotunda at the end of the crossing. But he transformed the two-story elevation of the interior and the outline of the wedge-shaped block to converge at the front of the plan. That these exercises were familiar to the contemporary audience is suggested by the fact that the building, transformed by the use of a simplified perspective, was recognized by Cassiano del Pozzo, who identified it and added the same inscription that he'd written on the verso on the archaeological reconstruction of the tomb. Cassiano's confirmation of the location of the tombs by brief annotations on the versos of drawings after they were acquired by the museum suggests that the tombs, contrary to claims of Montano's critics, were authentic and still standing in the 17th century. It seems that Cassiano's got his draftsmen to check that they really did exist. In spite of the license of some of Montano's reconstructions, others show that he followed similar archaeological criteria as other 16th century architects, although the purpose of his drawings may have been remote from archaeology. It is almost certain that none of his drawings derive from an original survey by him, but there is some evidence to justify the site visits which Solia described in his preface to the selection of the designs which he published in 1625, when he asserted the importance of the plans over the elevations. He described Montano's working method. He wrote, "He descended into caves and grottos to see how the ancients laid their foundations of their buildings, but he finished the elevations and sections from his own exquisite genius." He is recognized by archaeologists as the first draftsman to draw the remains of the columbarium of the Liberty of Augustus on the Via Appia. And one building, the Nymphaeum at the Villa of the Gordiani, fascinated him, and he made several drawings of it. In one, on the left, he separated the authentic Roman ruins from other ruins on site to show only the central octagonal room, as most other Renaissance architects had done. He shows it in enclosure wall, which is a preference, but apart from that, the central room is as the Roman building stood. In the second, he incorporated all of the ruins on site to construct a building which seems preposterous, the building with the ice cream cone on the top, but which is actually close to the building as it survives on site. There you see the drawing, the photograph, which was taken by Ashby at the beginning of the century. It's actually still on site and still looks exactly like that. A medieval stair rises like a cone from the centre of the Roman octagonal room, and the complex geometry of the radiating rooms, which is shown on Montano's drawing, and their entrances, which are often offset to the side of the bays, almost corresponds with the plan of the building on site, but he reverses the order of the rectangular and circular radiating rooms. A tomb with deep niches in a U-shaped ambulatory, which was also drawn by Ligorio, is shown by Montano within an enclosure wall. It has not been noticed before that there is still a similar tomb just off the Via Appia, near to the tomb of Priscilla, which has a medieval wall around it, which could have justified Montano's reconstruction of the tomb within an enclosure in the same way that he reconstructed the medieval stair. When Ligorio drew the tomb, Ligorio, the expert archaeologist, he correctly excluded the medieval wall from his drawing. Like other archaeologists and architects, Montano used coins as a source for some of his reconstructions. The Temple of Mars on the Capitol, which was a historical building, probably nothing survived in the Renaissance, was reconstructed from coins. But to authenticate the building, he added on the same page a detail of a capital, which was probably based on the antique capital, which originally belonged to the Porticus Deorum Consentium on the slopes of the Campidoglio, near to the probable site of the temple. Peruzzi, who was the source for so many of Montano's drawings, was criticized for his timidity and his professional reticence by Vasari, the great courtier. Yet he was more famous after his death than during his lifetime. He lies next to Raphael in the Pantheon. Today he is far less famous than his contemporaries Bramante and Raphael, whom he succeeded as Capamaestro of St. Peter's. But he was a highly capable practical architect who built palaces, villas, fortifications, and painted frescoes. But he was also an architect of great erudition, who believed in the power of drawings as a means of exploration and experiment. He must have inherited his use of drawings from his great Sienese predecessor, Francesco di Giorgio, who also tested his reading of Vitruvius against the evidence of the buildings of Rome by drawing them, and who was the first to recommend the use of drawings to analyze and study architecture. Peruzzi was without equal as a draftsman, and he was noted for his study of antique buildings. I was going to say something about the survival of Montano's drawings, of Peruzzi's drawings, but Montano's unrivaled knowledge of those drawings, in fact, deserves a separate lecture. The survival is not at all simple, because Vasari reported that much of Peruzzi's graphic material was lost. So Montano provides a vital link in the history of Peruzzi's drawings. Montano's drawings were available to visitors in Cassiano del Pozzo's encyclopedic collection, the Paper Museum, or Museum of Works of Art on Paper. Borromini certainly studied them. He absorbed the complex geometry of Montano's reconstructed plans of ancient buildings. I show on the right and left the plan of the dome at Sant'Ivo della Sapienza, the campanile, and on the right-hand side, Montano's plan based on intersecting triangles. As well as the elevations and sections with superimposed domes, and I show also a plan of made by Montano with the concave exedra, which comes from the Temple of Baalbek, which also was a source for Borromini. As well as elevations and sections with superimposed domes from his exquisite genius. Montano's drawings were made as examples or models to instruct architects trained in the academic tradition, in a period when antiquarian and archaeological research on the one hand had separated from the practice of architecture on the other. Montano's images revived Peruzzi's corpus and put it to use to encourage architects to experiment with a full range of geometrical figures. They show how plans with diagonal axes and aggregate plans eliminate the structural and aesthetic problems which arise in unified central buildings. His fanciful reconstruction of ancient tumuli as architecturally complete and ordered buildings caused him to think about lighting the core of a building from a remote source, a problem which is not inherent in tomb design. He found curious and delightful ways of achieving them. On the left-hand side uses the use of the superimposed dome with oculi, of achieving indirect lighting, and in so doing suggested the potential of sectional design. In his treatise on the nobility of the arts, Ligorio, who was embittered by the shabby treatment of his enemies, who had secured his dismissal in 1568 from St. Peter's workshop by Pius V, at a time when there was a shift away from works inspired by the ancients. Ligorio vented his anger while expressing the dilemma for craftsmen seeking training within the imitative tradition of the Academy. He wrote a scathing attack on the posturings of would-be masons and architects who attempted to imitate Michelangelo. Every mason and every surveyor wishes to be an architect. It is enough to make one sick that so much ignorance should befall to men of our day. So as to appear as excellent as was Michelangelo Buonarroti, they put on a hat and short boots with shoes over them, and have bushy eyebrows under the shaggy hat to imitate his knowledge. As if that were in the hat or boots, and as associating with a doctor, one learns to go dressed as one without the knowledge or method to be able to study as they do. In order to go about so dressed, they wish to appear doctors or Michelangelos. I think we all know that. The phenomenon highlighted by Ligorio's bitter sentiments is illustrated by a frontispiece of a collection of architectural engravings which was published in Amsterdam in 1646 and which is unnoticed. The publisher used Michelangelo's image in association with Montano's to promote the sale to dilettantes of engraved plates of contemporary buildings. It shows 4 architects, Vignola and Giovanni Battista Soria, There's Vignola, and there is Soria, who was the designer of the great ceilings of the Roman basilicas. That was Soria's most notable works, as well as publishing Montano's designs. It shows four architects, Vignola and Giovanni Battista Soria, who are both remote on the left and right, while Michelangelo, in the centre, discusses keenly an architectural idea which is caught by Montano, who sits at the table translating the idea into a drawing. Mercury, as the patron of artists, rushes forward, pointing to the construction scene in the monumental frame behind them. The image depicts, as eloquently as Ligorio's words, architecture as a process of imitation, focused on Michelangelo on the one hand and drawing on the other. Architectural education, based on copying drawings by other architects, progressed slowly in the Accademia del Disegno, where there was urgent need for visual models for architects to dwell on. Peruzzi supplied Montano with the resources for his work, the creation of small and accurate images of ancient buildings, which he also turned into exciting ideas for the kind of buildings Peruzzi had developed in the Allegory of Mercury. In so doing, he succeeded where other Renaissance architects, who had tried to create corpuses of drawings, had failed, like Claudio Ptolomeo, for example, had failed. He created a corpus of drawings of buildings after the antique, which are instantly absorbable and stimulating. His unconventional view of antiquity probably helped Borromini, a fellow Lombard, and Michelangelo's heir, to reach for his inheritance, take it up, and move forward. Thank you.
Some questions?
Yes?
Are there any questions?
Yes.
Which is then cut, and then provides a section, which is again perspectival again.
Yes.
Which in a way does not exist in Serio, who actually, when he does that, he actually does a cut, but then
Yes.
has the orthogonal projection of the sun and the
Yes.
elevation. And just sometimes in the other part, which is the section, has sometimes three dimensions. In sort of just sometimes pronounced just Is he the only one who uses drawings like that? I just haven't sort of seen any other kind of any other person using drawings like that.
Yes, he is, and he builds this consistent corpus of drawings, but Peruzzi also does drawings in that way. That's why I was concerned to establish whether the drawing that's presented by Dante as Vignola's design for the Temple of Porto is actually, I think, based on a design by Peruzzi, probably from Lavaco. And in turn, that goes back to the kinds of representations that Raphael was driving at for his reconstruction of ancient Rome, when he was going to reconstruct whole buildings in perspective.
But we don't have any evidence.
There's no evidence for that.
And in terms of Peruzzi's, did you exhaust all your drawings that perhaps could be related to Peruzzi?
Yes, practically all of them relate to Peruzzi, and in the catalogue I've drawn a table which shows actually the family of images that Montano relates them to, and they all derive straight from either Peruzzi or to albums which can be attributed to artists who were in his circle, so probably copying his designs. The drawings were so famous that it's...
I mean, the drawings by
Peruzzi was so famous that people were drawing them.
particular way of using this kind of convention.
Yes, the convention of the perspective of the interior and sometimes the perspective of the exterior as well, especially the use of perspective to reconstruct. I think that's an important thing. It's reconstruction.
And also perspective of the exterior cut and then interior
Yes.
side. This kind of two together.
The two things together is something which does occur in Peruzzi and hardly else in anybody else except people who are copying his work, or might be copying because they were in his circle.
I think that is quite fascinating
Yes, it's very rare. Yes.
And also what I think what you show quite brilliantly and sort of bringing all these examples of Montan's drawing is actually related to Borromini, at least in a
Yes.
sense kind of
Yes.
because what in a way appears quite always quite original and quite specific for Borromini without sort of knowing all these sources is sort of attributed usually to himself.
Yes. No, he took a lot from Montano, but there's quite a lot is written in the literature about the influence of Borromini. It's sort of it's Montano's great sort of claim to fame, but his relationship to the 16th century, which was very deep, just has tended to be neglected, which is why I concentrated on that this evening. But I think he was also very important for Robert Adam. And I think that the drawings did really enter the curriculum and continue to be used because they were still being collected even in the 19th century. The over 1,000 drawings which still exist, they're actually copies of the same ones that are in the zone. And there are one or two missing ones that are not in the prototypes of the engravings which are not in the zone, but are in other collections. They were all acquired by academic architects, and they continued to be acquired right through until the 19th century. So he's somebody that architects continue to look at, certainly.
I've got two questions. The first is about the way that it seems to me that the orthogonal projection, where you look at 10 to 45 degrees.
Yes. Yes.
Because of the curious distortion, makes it look as if the building itself diminishes from perspective.
Yes.
And consequently, that it looks like a kind of reversal of something like acceleration.
Yes.
Or that period of time that Borromini.
Yes. Yes.
And it relates in a generic sense to a process which I think in modern figures where the means of projection is then taken literally as a template to generate a form.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you see it also in Soane. And I'm trying to figure out, would that happen or could something else happen? Somebody takes the means of projection, which produces the current distortion, but then literally builds a form like it, as if
Well, I think it's possible. I mean, certainly the drawings exist before Palazzo Spada or before the Scalareggia. And they were certainly looked at by Borromini. And we don't know about Bernini, but we do know that Borromini, he was a close friend of Cassiano del Pozzo. So it's very likely that he actually looked at the drawings.
The second question I have is, it's always intrigued me about Genesis and other processes of reconstruction. That before completely modern scientific analysis of archaeology or sort of in practice, it seems to me very hard to see where somebody would stop being sort of objective and measuring and then where they would start inventing. And indeed, given the push from as to whether they would even dream of making such a thing, as if a kind of metamorphosis of the imagination or the function of drawing takes place in the very act of any
Certainly architects had an idea of how things should look from their study of other things. Palladio certainly had it. You see it particularly in the drawings of Palestrina, that he had a view of how it should be, and he drew it how he felt it should be and not how he measured it. Although he surveyed it, in fact, accurately, but when he came to doing the fair copy drawings of it, he reduced it to systems of proportion that he liked rather than what he was actually seeing on site. So you do see modifications of that sort.
It's just that in this case, I think Montano's apparent incompetence is, in a sense, sort of muddies picture.
Yes.
Such that, with someone like Peruzzi, completely competent drawing, when he decides to take Aston Dutch with reconstruction and presses his lot as archaeology in quite a lot of
Yes.
then you know roughly where you are.
Yes.
Whereas with this, it seems difficult.
Well, I think it just seems difficult for this. That's what I was saying about that strange plan, that you really wouldn't know it was the same tomb because of the way that it'd gone wedge shape. But obviously to Castiglione del Pozzo it presented no problem at all, because they were clearly doing this kind of designs were being produced all over the place. And it's simply because we haven't studied them, we don't recognise them. But the vast majority of Montano's drawings are actually fairly standard representations of the buildings. The plans are always accurate. They correspond with other drawings of the same building. He often offers two elevations. Sometimes he gives the Roman authentic one, and then he'll do the same plan with a modern dress, in a modern dress version, basically, of the same plan. He does that with the Temple of Venus in Rome. The plan is perfectly archaeological and perfectly correct, but the two different elevations. And then there are these, seemingly to us, about 6 or 7 totally dotty, apparently dotty, but I'm not convinced, of course, that they are, projects, which have in fact caused people to think that he's childlike and he really doesn't know what he's doing. His sections are usually a bit of a mess, but then you would expect a section for a tumulus tomb to be a bit of a mess, because if nobody knew what they looked like in elevation and you didn't know how to get light from the outside into the centre of the building, you actually would expect them to be not necessarily very accurate. But I'm sure that they were recognised and understood for what they were in their day. And Piranesi used them also in his archaeological researches. So he also had considerable respect for them, presumably because he knew exactly where they came from, as drawings which are copied after Peruzzi.